Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're all very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar. I hope you're all keeping well and looking forward to another very interesting presentation. The weather is unbelievable at the moment, so I said I better acknowledge it. We have an early summer, which is wonderful. I'm not sure how long it's going to stay, but we'll certainly enjoy it when it lasts. Plenty of silage getting cut. Animals are looking very happy in the fields, and farmers are looking very happy around the country. So long may it last. Agroforestry is the integration of trees with either crops or livestock on the same land. It aims to achieve additional benefits in comparison to keeping agriculture and trees separate, but how does this benefit animal health and welfare? And we're delighted to be joined this morning by Teagasc Forestry Research Officer Dr. Ian Short, and also a livestock researcher with the Organic Research Centre in the UK, Dr. Lindsay Whistance. And we're also joined by Teagasc Forestry Advisor and Coordinator with the AF for EU Horizon Project, John Casey, who's going to help me out with questions today. Good morning, John. How are you?
Great, Cathal. And yourself?
Good. Not a bother, John. Where are you based this morning, John?
I'm in sunny Mallow. It's beautiful today. Really nice.
Yeah. I think I know we talk an awful lot about weather, but I think it needs we need to when it comes good.
It's a pepper day.
Yeah. So, Lindsay, you're a research officer with your livestock research officer, and I suppose the first thing I'll ask you, Lindsay, is what interests you in agroforestry?
Yeah, that's a good question. My main driver is looking at livestock systems that give the animals a life worth living. And at the Organic Research Centre, we've had an agroforestry programme for a long time. And some of my colleagues back in the day asked me to contribute something on animal welfare. And the more I looked at it, the more I realised that in systems, trees bring a huge number of benefits to livestock, and I won't say it's my only area of research, but it's certainly the dominant area of research, simply because there are so many things that they can bring.
Yeah, and Ian, something similar for you, just to kick off. Your background is mainly forestry. What piqued your interest in tipping into agroforestry?
Well, when I was at school, I was looking for what degree I would do, and I went for an interview in Wales, in University of Wales in Bangor, to do a forestry degree. And while I was there, a lecturer, Terry Thomas, asked me about agroforestry. So I went to an agroforestry interview, and it was just a fascinating topic, and that got me into agroforestry. And I've had that interest ever since.
Yeah, excellent. And what we're going to do this morning is Ian is going to kick off with a short presentation first to set it up, and then Lindsay's going to follow. So Ian, if you'd like to start sharing your slides there now.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Ian Short, and I'm a forestry researcher here in the Teagasc Forestry Development Department. My research interests include applied and alternative silviculture, continuous cover forestry, agroforestry, and knowledge transfer. And this morning, I'm delighted to provide a very brief introduction to agroforestry before we get into the main part of the webinar. So we'll begin with the question, what is agroforestry? Well, the EU defines agroforestry as land use systems in which trees are grown in combination with agriculture on the same piece of land. But put simply, agroforestry is farming with trees, particularly where there are significant interactions between the tree and the agriculture components. Now, there's two main types of agroforestry: silvopastoral, which is when you've got trees with a livestock system, such as dairy or dry stock, sheep, pigs, or poultry. The example shown there on the left is from Loughgall, and it's an experimental site. And then there's silvoarbor, which is trees with a tillage or horticultural system. And the example on the right there is rows of coppice providing shelter to the adjacent horticultural crops. So agroforestry in Europe is quite common. There was a project done, an EU-funded project called the Ag-Forward project, that estimated, using the land use and land cover survey data, the Lucas data from 2015, that there is 15.4 million hectares of agroforestry in Europe. And that's nearly 9% of the utilised agricultural area. And by far the most important agroforestry was silvopastoral, with 15.1 million hectares. The map there on the slide just illustrates some of the sites that have been identified and listed in the European Agroforestry Federation's Agroforestry Map of Europe. Now, using the same data and reporting the same data, in 2017, a journal paper reported the results of that work and showed that Ireland had nearly 225,000 hectares of agroforestry, about 4.5% of utilised agricultural area. Now, this was all categorised as silver pastoral and specifically bocage. A bocage is categorised as consisting of small pastoral fields surrounded by trees and hedgerows. And in Ireland, this is an artefact of historical land use management. So we have had agroforestry historically, but agroforestry itself as a field of study is relatively new. So it was first defined in around about 1977 in the context of tropical regions, but it soon piqued the interest in temperate regions as well. In 1986, the UK Agroforestry Forum was formed, predominantly consisting of UK researchers with an interest in agroforestry. And in later years, the forum changed its name to the UK Farm Woodland Forum, and that's what it's still called today. The researchers within the forum established a network of silver pastoral research sites that all had a common management and common measurement protocol. And one of these sites was planted in 1989 in Loch Gall, County Armagh. Over the next 20 years, 3 of the UK Agroforestry Forum's annual meetings were held in Ireland. In 2011, EURAF, the European Agroforestry Federation, was formed to represent European agroforestry associations and promote the use of trees on farms throughout Europe, and 3 of its founding members are from Ireland. In 2014, DAFM first provided for funding for establishment of agroforestry, and this was under the Forest Service Afforestation Scheme using GPC 11 grant payment category 11. Then, in 2020, the Irish Agroforestry Forum was formed. The forum consists of farmers, policymakers, advisors, researchers, students, contractors, and others with an interest in agroforestry, and it currently has approximately 200 paid members. The Irish Agroforestry Forum held their first international conference in 2023 in Bantry, County Cork. And in more recent years, there have been new grant supports from DAFM for agroforestry. So these supports, some of them come from the CAP from 2023-2027. So under ACRES programme, there's trees in riparian zones, there's some tree planting, and there's tree belts to capture ammonium. And these can all be considered as agroforestry. Agroforestry is eligible for BIS and also eligible for the organic premium payments. And then under the afforestation programme 23 to 2027, there's the FT8, the Forest Type 8 silver pastoral systems, which is for establishment of silver pastoral systems. And just recently, in the last few months, there's the 2 pilot measures that have been announced on silver arable systems and establishing forest gardening. Now, currently, the FT8, the Agroforestry Establishing Silver Pastoral Systems forest type, is the 3rd most popular one that's in the Forest Service system for grants and funding. So these supports are provided partially because there is a host of potential benefits from planting trees on farms, in addition to creating timber. So these benefits, in addition to creating timber, could be related to, for example, water quality or management of livestock, or perhaps inter-farm biosecurity or provision of shelter. But how exactly can planting agroforestry influence all of these? Well, it's through modifications made by the trees and their interactions with agriculture. So this diagram represents some of the causal relationships resulting from introducing trees into an agricultural field. For example, introducing trees will cause a change in radiation under the trees compared to being in an open field. Introducing trees can result in products from the trees, for example, timber, fruit or nuts and fodder, but it can also influence pests, alter the soil and introduce competition or facilitation for resources. And these interactions need to be managed. Trees can alter the precipitation because it's intercepted by the tree canopy. And trees will change the wind pattern, altering localized wind speeds and potentially affecting changes in crop plants, but also contributing to the change in the energy balance of the system. And the change in radiation under the tree canopy causes this change in energy balance as well. And this can affect evapotranspiration and temperatures. So the introduction of trees can introduce new interactions between them and the agricultural components of the enterprise. And these interactions are often mediated by the microclimate or via the soil. Today's webinar is going to focus on some of the interactions between trees and livestock. Lindsay Whistance is a senior livestock researcher with the Organic Research Centre in the UK. She's worked on animal behaviour, health and welfare research since 2003. Her research interests include human-animal relationships and the role that diverse species-rich environments can play in offering high welfare conditions as well as food and medicine for domestic animals. Lindsay, you're very welcome, and we look forward to what will be a very interesting talk on agroforestry and its benefits for animal health and welfare.
So as Ian says, I'm going to be focusing on the animal benefits that trees can bring in the landscape. So when we talk about animal welfare, when I talk about animal welfare, I want to really point out that it has three major components. So clearly we need to talk about the physiological health of the animal. And historically in farm systems, this is the place where we put the most emphasis, not least because it's the easiest to measure, but the relationship between health and productivity has been more clear to us. So this is where in the past we've put most of our efforts. But really, there are three components to animal welfare, and that also includes the emotional health of the animal and their ability to function as a member of the species that they were born to be. And we now have a much better understanding of thwarting some animal behaviours, which we call animal needs, can lead to emotional distress and then impact on the animal's physiological health. So in the round, when we talk about animal welfare, we should be considering all three of these elements. And here I'm going to be talking about the benefits that the trees bring to these three aspects of welfare. Before I go into the animals themselves, I'm just going to mention that the benefits, whilst they can be direct benefits, they can also be indirect benefits by having the trees within the landscape itself. Now, Ian has just touched on a few of those components. So here I've collected a selection of slides where we can see in the top left-hand corner the only bit of grass available in this summer of 2018, which was an incredibly dry year. This is under the tree, so there are a few forbs in the foreground, but everything else is bone dry. And the farm behind this photograph has just sold its livestock. He's gone through his winter feed already and has got nothing left, and that farm was then empty of stock for the rest of the year. Just below that image, we've got a picture from Scotland, where you can see even without the leaves, this tree canopy is able to offer some measure of thermal benefit. And we know that the ground temperatures under trees can be as much as 6 degrees warmer than open ground, and this also helps with early spring grass growth and extending that grazing system. And at the same time, it's offering somewhere warm for outwintered animals to lie down and rest. The bottom right-hand image is also from Loughgall. It's from the Ash Silvopastoral Research System. And this has demonstrated that in wet land, the grazing system can be extended on average for 15 weeks. And the predominant number of weeks there is in the autumn period. And of course, we now have to spend some time focusing on carbon sequestration, and some research that has looked at different methods of land interaction, human and land interaction, indicates that silvopastoral systems have the greatest capacity to sequester carbon. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the emotional health of animals. And we know that trees do bring some benefits for social relationships. Most of this research has been done on cattle, but we find that they are more cohesive. They stay more closer together in silvipastoral systems when compared to open pasture, and they show much less negative interactions. So in amongst trees, their negative interactions, so butting, pushing, those kinds of behaviours, are around 20% of total social behaviours, whereas on open pasture, this is around 60% of their social behaviours. There's more social licking, and we know that social licking, or the licking of another animal, brings the receiver's heart rate down, so it has an additional calming effect. There is some research that's been done on poultry, and whilst we find that their fear response, so we know about the fight and flight responses, but there is also a freeze response, which birds often show. And whilst they're showing a similar amount of freeze response to a fear incident, they're recovering much quicker under the canopy of trees. There is also some evidence that this positive social relationship can also be linked to human-animal behaviour. So animals are showing less fear towards humans, which of course can increase the ability to handle them better and more safely without risk of injury to both the human and the animals. And we think at least part of this is attributed to them having something physical to hide behind. Body care is one of the biggest things that trees can bring to the landscape. So by having them physically within the animal's landscape enables them to access them, and particularly where branches or stems are low enough for them to rub against. And you can see from these images that when they do have access to different configurations, they can access pretty much all body parts. And talking to some farmers, a particular farmer with sheep has noticed that when the sheep are in a field where they do have access to somewhere to rub, fewer of his sheep get cast. So they're less risk of having, for example, their eyes pecked out by crows. And with cattle, there's research that's been done on grooming behaviour, which shows similar to being licked by another cow, their heart rate goes down. Some of the things that they are doing with this body care every day is cleaning their skin and their coat of dead skin, dead hair, seeds that can penetrate the skin, and external parasites. And there is some research done on cattle and tick populations showing that when they have somewhere to rub, their tick infestations are significantly lower than without somewhere to rub. And in terms of climate change, the cleaning of the skin enables them to maintain better temperature regulation. And again, for cattle, this is particularly important because our Bos taurus species are less able to sweat. So their sweat functions are not as good as Bos indicus cattle. So having that clean coat becomes increasingly important to them in hot weather. So just before we go on to talking about hot and cold stress, I just wanted to really talk about thermal stress and what it is. So all of our animals have a core temperature, which is a normal temperature, and it's a fairly narrow temperature, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of this slide. And when we say they're in a thermoneutral zone, this is where their core temperature is maintained, but where metabolic rates are low. So within this system, core temperature is managed by waste heat from metabolic processes. So it's a passive system. It's not costing the animal any energy to do this. So within this normal temperature, they are functioning and using energy for growing, for normal activities. And on the outside of each of these temperatures, so when they get to the lower critical temperature or the upper critical temperature, they're now having to employ other mechanisms, so either generating heat or trying to stop heat. And you can see at these edges you have this sort of temperature where they're starting to become aware that they're going to have to do something about this. They're either getting too cold or they're getting a little bit too hot. And this is critically where they change their behavior. So this is seeking shade and seeking shelter. It's the cheapest, easiest way to maintain thermal comfort without costing the animal too much energy. And if this is not possible within the landscape, within the environment that they are living in, then they're having to employ other mechanisms. So, for example, if they're overheating, then they will start to up their respiration rate, they will start to pant and also reduce food intake. So they're trying to stop adding to that metabolic heat. Conversely, if they're getting too cold, then you'll have the coat responding. So you have that piloerection, the coat standing up, shivering behavior, and increasing the food intake if that food is available in order to up metabolic heat production. Of course, there will come a certain point in extreme weathers where none of these responses will function, and that will end in animal death. If we focus on cold stress first, most of the research done here has been on sheep and the survival of lambs. And I should say that there are lots of holes in our understanding, and much of the research has been directed to critical points. So that will also inform some of the information that I pass on to you in this talk. So as I said, the research has been typically done on lamb survival. So lambs have very little energy reserves. They're not able to generate any metabolic heat when they're born. They're born cold or they're born wet, so they can lose around 10 degrees of body heat in the first half hour of life, unless the mother is able to clean them, lick them, get them standing and get them suckling in pretty short order. If the ewe has multiple lambs, then it becomes even more critical, and the landscape plays an increasingly important role in these scenarios. So we say that around 30% of lamb deaths can be prevented by good shelter. And we also know that if the shelter looks after the ewe as well, so it's not too far for her to travel for food and water, she's more likely to stay closer to the shelter, enabling the lamb to benefit from that, because when she moves away, she takes the lamb with her. And research has shown that if you can keep the ewe in amongst the shelter for at least a day for singles and up to 3 days for multiple births, then it also improves the dam-lamb relationship, and that can then improve survival at weaning time. So it has two knock-on effects, beneficial effects, so survival at birth leading to improved survival at weaning. There are some rules of thumb for animals. So for beef animals, here we have this rule of thumb that for every 1 degree they go below their lower critical temperature, they'll need around 2% extra energy for maintenance purposes. So the average, let's say, beef animal with a dry coat, a good winter coat, its lower critical temperature is around 0 degrees. But when we add rain into that mix, its lower critical temperature can rise to 15 degrees. So you can see already a wet animal is going to need around 30% extra feed. If we then add wind into that mix, so it's whipping that ambient temperature, reducing the effective temperature overall, you start to come to around 50% extra feed required for these animals that have no access to shelter. Now, this would not be the animal's first response, and we know that where food is available in more exposed areas, they will trade off. So they will go out and feed and then go back to the shelter as quickly as they can. But shelter becomes a critical part for them. And of course, by adding the extra feed, yes, we may maintain production, but we have done very little to improve the animal's welfare circumstance. Now, I've put this image up. This is not an image from the UK. This is from the US, because it demonstrates that we should be mindful of animal welfare, not just the survival of young, but animal welfare throughout cold periods. And whilst we may never see storms like this, we are seeing really some strong storms. And if we go back to 2018, where we had the double whammy of Beast from the East and Storm Emma, we must remind ourselves that we lost around about 500,000 animals in the UK, particularly in Wales and Scotland, from those two storms. And it's worth noting that whilst animals can adapt to colder or hotter weather over time, they are less able to adapt to these shock weather patterns. So they become increasingly vulnerable to shifting and volatile weather, which we will face more and more in the future as the climate changes. So this is an image of two systems where trees that are existing in a landscape for another purpose and trees that have been planted for animal welfare, how they are functioning together. So on the right-hand side, we've got some commercial trees that are intended to be harvested, but the farmer puts in a stile, and any stormy weather, he opens the stile and allows the cattle to go in and be sheltered under the trees, acting as a living barn. Now, I am careful about using the term living barn. I think it can be overused when really it's a shelter belt we're talking about. But here you've got good canopy, you've got perhaps a bed pack of needles, and coming as close to a barn as you probably can in terms of living plants. Similarly, on the left-hand side, this is a system in Scotland. Again, it's commercial trees, again planted for harvesting, but they now offer so important a part of the sheep system here that they are now a permanent housing, particularly for ewes coming up to lambing. So they're sheltered here, and the bottom field that's been planted specifically for early grass growth, so upping the temperatures, increasing that early grass growth, and offering shelter for the lambs down the field. And this particular system has been so successful that the farmer's been able to move away from the local breed to a more commercial breed with fewer inputs. So if we think now about heat stress, shade is likely going to be the most important thing at a global level that trees can bring to the livestock landscape. And of course, animals can cope with a certain amount of heat stress. They can recover in the cooler periods, but it's worth noting that this cooler period is typically nighttime, and the climate scientists are forecasting that this nighttime cooling is going to be lost as we move more seriously into climate change. And we don't yet know what that accumulative heat stress is going to do to livestock, even at these milder temperatures. So that's something we're going to have to understand as we move into those changing climate scenarios. As we go into more heat stress, even with mild heat stress, dairy cattle are producing less milk each day, because one of the responses to heat stress, of course, is to stop or slow down eating to reduce that metabolic heat load. As they move further into heat stress, you start to see behavioural changes without shade. So the respiratory rate increases. They might show panting behaviour. Stress hormones are going up. As I said, their feed intake is going down, and this disturbs rumen microbes. It increases metabolic disorders. And we also have an inflammation cascade. And this is happening because while the gut is closing down, the blood that services the gut and ordinarily holds it as an impermeable system, that blood is now being redirected towards the skin to help with the cooling down processes. And that causes the gut to then become permeable. So the toxins that are in the gut can now move freely into the bloodstream and triggering that inflammation cascade. Research done in Italy, for example, shows that cows with no shade have higher levels of mastitis. So the gut system is being closed down, and alongside this, the reproductive system is also being closed down. And in evolutionary terms, this makes a lot of sense, not investing energy into future generations when the current generation is under threat, wasting energy on something that might not happen, essentially. So we have negative impacts on estrus expression. If the animals are in kid, in lamb, in calf, then you have negative impacts on embryo growth and fetal development. And calves born to dairy cows, at least, are smaller in size. And the cow is then producing milk of an inferior quality compared to a non-heat stress cow. And that includes both the amount and the quality of that, including colostrum too. So the negative scenarios don't end there, sadly. So as I said, we've got smaller calves. They've been compromised through their development. So they're not just smaller in size, but their organ sizes are smaller. And that includes all of the organs that are related to defense mechanisms, including the spleen. And something else that's going on here is a reduction of passive immunity. So we know that there is roughly around 24 hours where the gut is wide open so that the immunoglobulins that they are receiving through the mother's colostrum can move directly through the gut and into the bloodstream, thus transferring this passive immunity. The death of these the closing of the gut is related to the natural death of these cells. So the gut cells are being replaced by normal gut cells. And so anything then that goes into the gut is being digested rather than transferred into the bloodstream. And what we know about these heat-stressed calves is that the death of these cells are already happening before the calf is born. So this window of passive transfer is much shorter than in calves that are born healthy to non-heat stressed cows. So it's perhaps no surprise that the cull rate is higher for calves that are born to heat stressed cows. And the negative impacts of both to the cow and to the calf can be measured into the third generation. So there is a really long-term knock-on negative effects. And we've not done any kind of economic research in the UK, but in America they have, and they've estimated the cost of heat stress to the dairy industry is now approaching $100 million every year. And for the beef industry, this is around $400 million every year. So it's a very, very costly thing for the industry, but let's remind ourselves that all of this is based effectively on poor welfare for the animals. So the positive thing that trees can do is that when you put them into the landscape in a well-designed silvopasture system, we can see that skin temperature or coat temperature of black cows can be reduced by around 4 degrees. Solar radiation can be reduced by around 58%. And we find that when animals have access to shade, they are more likely to maintain their normal behavioural patterns, which includes feeding behaviour, ruminating, lying and resting, where without shade, they tend to stand more. So they're getting disrupted rest patterns alongside that. So we find they're better able to cope with the weather and maintain their normal activity patterns. And that then, of course, includes production outcomes. There's some research done in Texas looking at feedlot cattle with and without shade, show that cattle with shade can reach their target weights 3 weeks earlier than those without any shade. And of course, the knock-on effect of proper silvopastoral systems, as opposed to the odd tree here and there, you are less likely to get camping behaviour. So the animals are utilising the resources more evenly across the landscape, and therefore also depositing nutrients more evenly across that landscape. So if we shift now to looking at the benefits that trees can bring in terms of part of the diet, well, we can see that all of our livestock are browsers as well as grazers. So this is some work that was done in Scotland, and they looked at the annual composition of food intake for each of our stock. So for cattle, their browse intake is around 12%. For sheep, it's around 20%, and for goats, it's up to 60%. But this can vary quite considerably through different weather patterns, for example, or different seasons. So this might be a drought year where there's very little grass available and the only green that is around is browse. And it might also be spring when there are lots of tasty young shoots available. And you can also see by these images that animals will work pretty hard to get access to browse. And when cattle at least are allowed into a new pasture where there are hedgerows or trees available, browse is the first thing that they will check out before they start to graze. So overall, the message is that trees can compare very well to grasses grown in the same landscape. And this is some work that we did, this was published in 2021, looking at energy and protein source of in oak, willow, and alder across 2 different seasons from 3 different sites. And you can see here, when looking at the requirements for 20 kilo and 40 kilo lambs, that these trees all offer a very good supplement, at least. And I think it's important to say that even if the trees can fulfill 100% of the animal's needs, we really shouldn't be talking about replacing grass. This is an addition to their diet. It's part of resilient landscapes, and adding diverse choice for them, as well as offering a source of on-farm food for the farmer to provide for their livestock. I suppose I just want to make note of alder. So alder continues to be of interest because it is a nitrogen fixing tree, but the reality is that animals don't particularly like browsing on it. It is a browse tree, and if it's been coppiced where there's very early young growth, they may browse on it, but it's classically a tree that rarely needs protection even from wild deer. One of the things I wanted to mention was the condensed tannins that they bring, and this can have a positive effect on protein quality. We have to mind the amount of that, so it should be less than 5% dry matter intake. It can help with emissions, so including methane and nitrous oxide. The most interesting thing to me, I think, with trees is that they offer a good source of minerals. We have much to learn in this regard, and from these images you can see that there are species differences. So the willow is good for zinc. We have site differences, so the selenium is high in all species from site 1, but not in site 2 or 3. Cobalt is also good for zinc, and we have a seasonal change. So with iodine, it is higher in all of the samples in the later months compared to the June samples. So species is the strongest influence, and season is less important for minerals compared to protein, which is higher earlier in the year. The one thing I did want to say was it looks as if the minerals are sustained over time. So these samples were stored for 9 months, and the mineral content, even though the content of other elements went down, the mineral content stayed stable. And I pulled out these three. You can see in red in the fresh goat willow, and these are related. So this is phosphorus, calcium, and sulfur. And this is related to the image on the next slide in the top left-hand corner, with the steer with the dead rabbit in its mouth. So this is related to animals looking for minerals in the landscape when they're not available either in the plants or not supplemented. But those three minerals that I pointed out have been highlighted as some of the minerals that will trigger this kind of behavior. What this picture demonstrates is that animals are able to detect deficiencies within themselves, and they have mechanisms to go looking for sources of those minerals when they are deficient. This is an abnormal behavior, and it might be somewhat kinder to allow perhaps some goat willow to grow in this moorland, which is a typical setting. In medicinal terms, the salicin, we know that salicylic acid components are a precursor for aspirin, which we use as a painkiller. So it's been strongly related to willows, although it's available in other plants as well. Purple willow is the highest, but goat willow again comes out very well. And we know that animals will choose this. It's not clear how they know. It might be the bitter taste of it, but when offered different willow sources with different salicin content, all of the sheep went for the higher salicin levels. So it's very clear that they can make decisions at this level, though the motivation in this particular research was not clear. With the tannins, we also know that condensed tannins can help reduce parasite loads, where heavy parasite burdens have been reduced by 50% when animals have been allowed to feed on high tannin plants, and not as effective as chemicals, but neither do the animals show resilience, the worms show no resilience to tannins compared to chemicals. So it looks as if historically, although less effective, it is a very sustainable approach towards managing chemicals. Yeah, well, if we want to feed the animals, then we need to know how to feed them, I guess. And browse is the easiest form. So if we're looking at browse heights, of course, the access has to be critical if we're going to say it's a part of their diet. So for cattle, the browse height is 2 meters. For sheep, it's 1.2 meters. And for goats, it's non-existent. These are termed vertical grazers, and if they can climb a tree, they'll pretty much strip a tree. But of course, these are maximum heights. So if we're going to add browse in any meaningful way, then bringing it lower to the ground so the animals can keep a relaxed posture would be a kinder thing to do, let's say. And then if we want to preserve it, well, we do have methods of preserving, which of course requires some kind of management. You might pollard, which increases your returns. You'll get more branches and more leaf and less lignin. Drying and ensiling are two methods, and tree silage is now of increasing interest, let's say, with some big research going on in this field at the moment. Thank you, and apologies for the rush. There's so much to say all of the time.
That was excellent, Lindsay, and apologies for rushing you at the end, because the last couple of slides are really, really, really interesting. And that picture of the animal was that a rabbit in its mouth? If a picture ever painted 1,000 words, that's the one that I'll see for the rest of my life anyway. So well done. I suppose just to kick off, we have lots of really interesting questions coming in, but Lindsay, there's one, I suppose, if you look at the systems in Ireland, the predominant systems in Ireland, if you look across our country, we have a lot of hedgerow, a lot of tree-lined hedgerow. would you account a tree-lined hedgerow does that kind of come under the agroforestry heading, or is it separate?
Oh, well, I'm not so strict. There may be others who disagree with me, but I think if it's a tree that has a function, whether it's a line of trees that are cut short or any kind of design of trees, if they have a function, then they are part of agroforestry. And I would almost argue that they always have a function.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose as a follow-up to that as well, another question came in is there's kind of two things. Obviously, if there's a hedgerow, we're encouraging farmers to leave them there and let them do their thing, be it a normal hedgerow or tree line, whatever it may be. But for the agroforest that you're looking at, do you encourage farmers to leave those forests in all the time, or is there some farmers that might cut them after a lifespan and use them as I suppose in a production system almost?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question, isn't it? And I guess it comes down to what function they are performing as a hedgerow. So if they're I suppose have shelter belt benefits, then their reason for being in situ is really important. But then again, we know that healthy hedgerows require some kind of management, and over time, let's say classically, you would allow a hedgerow to grow up and you would lay it. I don't know if that's similar in Ireland, but it's absolutely the case over here. So you would have this sort of rotational stages of hedgerow, if you like. We have a booklet that was produced by colleagues called Productive Hedges, and it absolutely talks about the benefits that you can gain from active hedgerows, if you like. So they're not just passive shelter belts. But, as I say, if the shelter is very, very important, then I guess you have to think about the losses while the hedgerow's not in situ. But maybe doing it in sections.
Yeah. John.
One thing I would say about hedgerows as well is if people talk about doing their own thing, there can be some benefits, and it might not work for all systems, but there's typically some back fencing along hedgerows. And I've seen some farmers do this quite successfully where they back fence, but it's a tight fence. So the fencing is right up against the hedge, and anything that comes through the hedge then is browsed freely, but they're protecting the core of the hedgerow. So they're sort of optimizing the browsing availability.
Yeah, no, and just to let people know, we might stay on an extra 5 minutes this morning just to give John a chance to get a few questions in because it's a really good topic. So, John, we'll let you fire away.
Could I just mention beforehand that I suppose there's a difference between agroforestry and the agroforestry scheme. The agroforestry scheme doesn't have hedgerows as part of it, but the agroforestry does. And bocage management, like Ian mentioned earlier on in northern France, is a form of agroforestry where they're actively managing the hedgerows and producing timber and other goods from the hedgerows. So this is agroforestry. It's just not scheme agroforestry as we have here. I suppose one of the questions, and just directly relating to Lindsay's presentation, was the connection between heat stress and gut health. And is this also true of cold stress? Is one of the questions that has been asked.
Yes, absolutely. It's just been less researched, and this is one of the restrictions that we have. Often the research is targeted towards pinch points in productive systems. It's really about managing production, let's say, and when production is not impacted to a degree, or losses. We've got these big ranges in the US and Australia, and a certain amount of deaths are accepted as part of the system. So there's less research, let's say, on those kinds of things. But with cold stress, it depends on life stages. So, of course, if you're a newborn lamb, then death is like the worst outcome. But you have slower growth rates, you have less activity, you have less play behavior. these animals are coping rather than thriving under these conditions. In adults, it's not just the animals, it's going to be the landscape as well. So if you've got very, very wet landscapes, you're going to have a risk of poor foot health. Coats that are not able, so you saw that animal from Nebraska, that coat is not able to trap warm hair, so the cold stress is going to be even greater. And in these systems, you often get frostbite. You'll get loss of extremities, so ears that are lost to frostbite. But it's not going to be the same system. So blood, instead of blood going outwards, blood will go closer to the core to try to keep the core hot. So that's where you get cold extremities. So that, typical like in humans, frostbite comes from blood not servicing those extremities. I'm not sure if I've answered that clearly enough, but
another question that arose then is, what would you regard as a well-designed agroforestry for a beef cattle system? What would you regard as the optimum design for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's $1 million question, isn't it? But I guess it partly depends on what other things you want from the system. The challenge is the more you want, the more trade-offs you make between things. So if you're looking to harvest the wood as a crop, you're looking to harvest fruit and nuts as a crop, or you want something more out of it, then you will be making trade-offs between certain things. If you're looking to do it exclusively for the stock, well, it partly depends on, are the animals out all year? Can the land tolerate the animals being out all year? And if so, looking at your weather patterns, so heat stress, cold winds, are they all part of your story? And maybe directing your planting scheme if you have a fixed way the animals move around the landscape. Are there some areas that would need wind shelter more than others? So, if you're always overwintering in certain fields, then perhaps focus shelter belts and perhaps even a denser canopy in those areas. So I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of grass growth, and there are lots of methods. It also partly is determined by your machinery requirements as well. So do you need to get into fields? Are you harvesting silage? Are you managing the landscape with machinery? And that will also inform how you plant. Ideally, a little bit of shade, a light shade across much of the landscape, certainly in summer conditions, would be of greatest benefit to the animals, but at the same time minimizing the impact of grass growth, the negative impacts on grass growth.
I suppose it's important to say under the agroforestry scheme, it's permitted to have trees both in rows, evenly spaced, but also to have blocks in which the blocks could be fenced off, and the animals can move between the blocks and use them as shelter. And then later, trees are more developed, the fencing can be taken away, and the animals can be underneath fencing for large.
Yeah, and those blocks can be particularly useful if, for example, you have an area where there are flies, so nuisance flies, allowing the animals to get in amongst the trees helps with that. Often nuisance flies are wood periphery, so they stay in the sun but close to the trees. So allowing the animals to penetrate the trees would be good for them. And of course, with block systems, this is not about biodiversity, this particular talk, but you will have better biodiversity where you're grouping trees together compared to rows.
The next question is more related to the nature of agroforestry itself in Ireland. The question was: Is land planted under the agroforestry scheme? Is it regarded as forestry, and is it a permanent land use change? So the answer is yes, it is.
Okay, thank you, because I don't know that.
No worries.
Yeah, Ian, actually, just on that, like you're around Ireland's forestry for a long time now. What are the main barriers? Is it exactly that when you put in a forest that you're not allowed to take it out potentially? Is it the same with a commercial forestry and agroforestry? Once it goes in, it's in for life. Is that correct?
Yeah. So if you plant agroforestry under the agroforestry scheme, it falls then under the Forestry Act. So that land is then categorised as forest land, and therefore must be replanted if it's felled, and also you'd have to have a felling license as well. So it's treated fairly similar to forestry in that respect. Yeah.
Do you think that's a kind of one of the main barriers that we have to promoting any type of forestry even?
Yeah, we have done some research, and there is the perception that that is a barrier, and I think part of that is that owners may feel that they are limiting future management. Now, limiting both what they can do, but also what their children or whoever succeeds with the farm can do. But it'd be interesting to have a study done looking at what would happen if that replanting obligation wasn't there, whether there would be a great increase in planting, and maybe there would be perhaps an increase in deforestation as well, but whether there'd be that balance met between an increase in planting being more than the deforestation that may occur.
Yeah, and just looking at some of the results from your Italian research, Lindsay, that you're looking at, maybe some of our dairy systems that maybe if hedgerows have come out over the years might actually benefit from some of the production benefits from animal health. You've mentioned
Yeah,
reducing milk, you mentioned um, actually even estrogen levels, all that kind of stuff, producing new calves and smaller calves.
I think this is an important point to make because I totally understand that having this imposed upon farmers, so the fear of not being able to make a choice, I can clearly see why that might deter some. But I think also it's important to say that we are now in our 11th year where we are 1 degree and higher than pre-industrial global heat. So we are now in a period of climate change, and trees are critical in providing shade and shelter. And I'm not sure we've got many years left of business as usual. And so if we can see the benefits of getting trees into the landscape now, then they're not going to go away over time, and it might be that we accept a reduction in what we are now expecting in terms of yield from each field. But, that reduction from the trees being in the landscape may be the difference between getting some crop and no crop moving into the future. Yeah, our world is changing, and I think the more buffers we have in our systems, the better the system will be in terms of resilience over time.
Okay.
I think the talks like that we've had today are so important in trying to get more trees planted in the country, because whilst the grant is very encouraging, for owners and landowners to be planting trees, we need to be able to demonstrate the additional benefits that trees can bring to their agricultural enterprise, to their bringing bread onto the table, if you like. So I think a talk like that we've had today from Lindsay has been very useful, and I hope the audience has found it very interesting and have seen trees maybe in a different light.
I might mention, Cathal, there's been a question about where you would get more information about this. So obviously enough, the Teagasc website and the forestry section of it contains a lot of information, both on agroforestry practices, but also some of the research as well. The Irish Agroforestry Forum has an excellent website that covers information as well. And lastly, I would say that the AF4EU project is generating business cases at the moment from across Europe that shows both the research and the practical application of agroforestry practices. And this platform will be up and going in the next couple of months, and it should be a good information resource as well.
I think we have time for one more question, John, if you like.
Well, I suppose the last question there was, could agroforestry be used in wet soils to help drainage and increase field productivity? I suppose it's more of a landscape management question, but if you'd like to answer it.
It certainly has been used, and there are a few examples of something like that in Ireland as well as elsewhere. And it has been found as well that planting trees as agroforestry on certain land types can extend the grazing season for that very reason, that it does kind of dry out the soil and make the ground trafficable, particularly at the tail ends of the grazing season, so in the spring and in the autumn, so that you get those extra weeks of grazing there.
Yeah, excellent. Look, unfortunately, we don't really have time for any more questions, but I'd just like to thank everybody for submitting questions. Some really interesting questions come in here, and thanks a million to Lindsay and Ian for answering those. It was a really interesting presentation. It's opened my eyes up to certainly additional benefits I hadn't heard of or thought of before in relation to agroforestry. So that's the start. If we can get the idea into people's heads, people kind of think about how they can incorporate it into their own farming system. John, thank you very much for helping out with the questions. Excellent as always. And also I'd like to thank Yvonne Marr, who's working away in the background there to ensure everything runs smoothly as always. And next week, just to let people know what we have, and apologies to Marichal if I pronounce her name incorrectly, but we have Dr. Marichal Buntiak, a Teagasc and Farm Bionet project manager, who will be joining us to provide an insight into farmer-focused biodiversity and agricultural knowledge network. And that's not to be missed. It's another really interesting webinar. So do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. And with that, slán go fóill.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.